discussion is Breakout Nations, and this refers to the title of Ruchir's book, which is the thing being discussed. Ruchir theorizes that, the growth of the world's emerging markets slowly is going to grind to an end, beginning with China, and then we don't know who will take its place, but he doesn't feel that India is on the list. He knows a thing or two because he's the head of emerging markets at Global Macro at Morgan Stanley Investments. So I'll briefly introduce Nandan, who will then lead the conversation. Nandan Nilekani, a lot of people know. His association with Infosys and also with the UIDAI, and you may also know that he received the prestigious Joseph Schumpeter Prize in 2006 and the Padma Bhushan. He's authored several books, including Imagining India, and now I'll just leave it to him to steer the conversation and bring out what we can from Ruchir's treasure trove.
Great, thank you. Jaipur Lit Fest, and today I have a very important and very interesting and very impressive guest here. Ruchir Sharma has many roles. He's a columnist, he's the author of Breakout Nations, a bestseller on emerging markets. He also heads emerging markets at Morgan Stanley globally, so he manages billions. How many billions, Ruchir? $25 billion of investment. So he's a heavy hitter. And I really have known Ruchir for a long time. I knew him since almost 20 years back. I used to be a columnist, and he never gave us his age because he couldn't admit that he was a teenager. So he's been writing for the last 20 years. He's done an amazing job. And Ruchir also happens to be from Jaipur. So his house is next door. So it's really a case of the prodigal returning to his home base. His house is in fact the lane next to Diggy Palace. So he's coming back in this new avatar to his hometown. So Ruchir, welcome, and it's great to have you on this session on your book Breakout Nations.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks.
Ruchir, I think there are a lot of books which have the theory of investing or the theory of how countries change and long stories about demographic dividend and all that. But yours is very much a practitioner's book. So what is what was the idea when you wrote this book, and what were you trying to express in the book?
Yeah, I just feel that a lot of books which are written from a very academic standpoint, like in the area of non-fiction. Mm-hmm. So we speak about books, which talk about various theories of growth, whether it's institutions or geography. And the problem I find with many of those theories is that they have very little practical application. Mm-hmm. And that was one thing which would always sort of bug me a bit.
So you've always been a practitioner.
Exactly, like being a practitioner. And the problem with many practitioners is that they don't have the time to write a book, or they don't think it's sort of important enough to write a book. So what I was trying to do was to bridge the gap here about writing a book which is both an academic sort of work, but more than that, a practitioner's guide in terms of what exactly is happening in the global economy, because that's what I do. I'm forced to put my money where my mouth is.
So you do a lot of travel, like all the various countries you talk about in your book. Have you visited each and every one of them?
Yes, I think that's the rule that I followed, which is there are about 20 countries mentioned in the book. It's an economic travelogue, and the whole idea was to make it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. And the most important thing in this book, I thought, was to keep the time frame very relevant, which is to speak about the next 3 to 5 years, because there's this, the old rule of forecasting used to be that you make as many forecasts as possible and you remind people when you're right.
Okay.
And to me, the new rule of forecasting now really is that you make such long-term forecasts that no one knows whether you or I will be here to know whether we are right or wrong. So I think that really has become to me the key thing here.
It's like those BRICS thing.
Exactly.
In 2050, India will be bigger than...
who cares, right? 2050, 2060, etc. We don't know. And if you look at the history of forecasting, everything that was said 10 years ago, has been turned on its head. When I started this business out in emerging markets investing, nearly 2 decades ago, it was hot. And then the late 1990s, we had a series of crises in the world, and everyone thought that emerging markets were these rat-infested, mosquito-laden markets, and what's the point of investing in these places?
Sure.
And now today, of course, we have a sort of different sentiment, or we don't now, it's soured a bit, but at least in 2010, the sentiment really was that, this is the place to go.
That this is one of the things I noticed from your book is that you don't think there are any set formulas, no magic bullets. There's nothing automatic. It's not a spreadsheet that you put some numbers and something happens. Each country, each region has its own unique sort of attributes, and you go and figure that out, right?
Yeah, I think I try and travel to one country a month, which is about spending a week in a country and sort of obsessing with it, which is that you basically stay in that country for a week, you meet with all the local characters, the politicians, the business people, and when you're in that country, you're obsessed with it because you're every sort of sensory moment of yours is picking up the inputs. There's the old saying that what you hear, you tend to forget.
So you talk to the taxi driver, you talk to the bellhop, all that?
Yeah, that's right. So you're just obsessed with it because you don't know as to what you're going to pick up at what point in time.
And since you do this in this almost experiential way where you just pick up all the senses, what is it, if you go to a country, what is it that finally gives you the instinct that this is a place that's going to do well in the future, that this is going to be a breakout nation?
Yeah, I think there are multiple rules. So in the book there's something called rules of the road, which are I've come up with a whole bunch of factors that you look at to try and figure out as to whether a country is going to rise or a country is not going to do that well over the next 3 to 5 years or so. And the entire sort of issue here is to focus on these rules of the road in a multiple format, which there's no single factor. There is no magic bullet. This is the one factor that you look at, and this is what.
But give me an example. When you go to some country, what happened which suddenly said, "Oh my God, this place is going to break out soon"?
Yeah, I went to Philippines. I remember, in early 2010. Now, Philippines had been a dog for many, many years. For 30 to 40 years, that country had been an economic
dog. I not understand the investing term.
Right, in terms of had been a real laggard. That Philippines used to be the second richest economy in Asia in the 1960s, and then after that it was surpassed by every other country in the world, in Asia at least, in terms of its per capita income. But I could figure out that the people there are getting really fed up. They want to vote in a leader now who sort of cleans the place up and who begins to change things. And we finally got an election in mid-2010. We got a new political leader out there who decided that, listen, I have to do something here to change
the
course of the country.
When you were doing this, roving around Manila
you meet the people, you met the various business people, etc. There was a sense of a combination of despondency, but also a sense that our backs to the wall.
Sure.
And I think in many societies what happens is that people tend to reform when they have their back to the wall.
So, I think it was John Templeton or Warren Buffett who said that you invest when there's blood on the streets. So is that one of your principles?
Yeah, in terms of when sentiment is very negative.
Yeah.
Like the best time to invest in India was a decade ago. When sort of nobody really cared about India on the global stage, about that in terms of how people didn't really care about it. And then what got me worried about India in turn.
So we'll come to the worrying part of it. But so you have this instinct that you get, and when you figure out how to invest. Now let's look at the other way. There's this famous story of J.P. Morgan when he got his shoe shine done on Wall Street in 1929.
Right.
The shoe shine boy was giving him tips, and then he said it's time to sell. Because the shoe shine boy is giving tips at the market, then the thing is gone over the top. So similarly, what are the moments that you have felt when a particular breakout nation or has just reached the limit of that and is actually going to be heading for trouble?
Well, I think I started to get worried about emerging markets and India in general in late 2010 because a couple of things happened.
Okay.
Like a couple of anecdotes which I mentioned in the book and I'd be happy to share with. I went, I'd come to India in late 2010 for the time of Diwali.
Okay.
And at that point in time, I was invited to one of those decadent farmhouse parties in Delhi. As you know, Delhi has these farmhouses on the outskirts.
Or something like that.
Yeah, where all the farmers have long left Delhi, but these concession pieces of land are now used as the sort of playgrounds of the rich.
Murders happen and this kind of place.
That's right. The playgrounds of the rich. So this party that I was invited to in late 2010, was a really sort of decadent affair that you sort of entered. The valets were juggling all the sort of Jaguars and Bentleys, etc.
Wow.
And I entered this place out there, and the cuisine was ordered from various countries. The whole jazz was there.
From
That's right, from Azerbaijan and stuff. So the truffles. So I went in there, and then I sort of got into a conversation with a young 25-year-old. And this young 25-year-old, sort of sorted me out very quickly. Thought I was one of those Wall Street types who had come here for investing. And so he sort of looked at me and then he sort of said, where else will the money go?
Oh, wow.
This sort of arrogance that this 25-year-old guy, and he was dressed in the typical sort of Delhi exporter's son, kind of variety, which is wearing this wearing this tight black t-shirt.
Our Delhi exporter sans here, so.
So he was wearing this tight black t-shirt, like jeans, the hair spiked with gel, and this attitude, like where else will the money go?
Okay, that was it.
And you knew that, it's not going to be that easy, that you'll sit here and this guy sort of in the middle of this farmhouse, not having seen much of the world and just made, a good life on the back of his father's newly found wealth, is going to sort of ride this tide of rising liquidity. So that was one anecdote.
So when that happened, did you go back to your office and say sell?
Well, I wrote a cover for Newsweek magazine, in fact, like saying that India's fatal flaw is crony capitalism. So it's sort of, now that was not the only anecdote. A series of incidents was sort of building up. The other one that I can mention is what happened in Russia. Soon after this trip to India, I went to Moscow. I was invited there by the president, or then the Prime Minister Putin, to sort of make a speech about what my thoughts as a global investor are about Russia. And so I went there not quite knowing what the exact stage was, but I was invited there to speak by him, so I went there on the stage. And I did not know this entire event is sort of has an audience as large as this and is being covered live on television. So I wasn't quite sure, but I made a very frank presentation on Russia, saying how a decade ago I used to like Russia, when sort of people were really paranoid about low prices of oil, and now today I'm concerned about Russia because there are very high prices of oil and no one's reforming out here. So I was very concerned about what was happening in Russia. Now Putin was sitting on the stage then, and he was taking notes down, and I thought this is all going very well, that you got a sort of leader out here who seems to be listening to you and stuff. And the next day I was really shocked, because in the press then, there was this entire onslaught against me. And the tone in the press was that, who needs your money? So this arrogance again, that, like in 2010, so much money is coming in, and if this guy's going to be critical about a country, forget it, who needs your money? And so that sort of again struck me that how the attitude had shifted. Like a decade ago, back to the wall, oil prices are at $20 a barrel, and they want to do something to try and reform themselves. And here they are today with oil prices at $100 a barrel, and the attitude is, who needs your money? And then shortly after that again, I had an interview with President Bush, the outgoing president then Bush, and it was a similar format for our clients. And I asked Bush this question that, that you said that when you went to Russia in the early 2000s, you looked into Putin's eye and you said that you saw a friend. I said, do you still hold that statement? Do you still feel Putin's the same guy? And he said, let me tell you as to how Putin has changed. He said that when I would meet him, like in the early 2000s, he'd be really paranoid about what's happening to Russia's debt situation, and he'd speak to me about that. He said by 2008, 2009, he'd be asking me by 2008 about America's debt, situation. And he mentioned this very interesting anecdote. He said that when he invited Putin to the White House first time in the early 2000s, Bush's dog was playing around. His dog was called Barney, etc. So, Putin saw it, must have sort of absorbed it. And then when Bush went to Putin's residence in 2008, Bush was sitting there, and Putin said, do you want to meet my dog? So, Bush says, Bush says fine.
Bigger than your
exactly.
dog.
So he says fine. So in came the dog. It was this huge dog, and basically Putin goes to Bush. See, bigger, better, stronger. Right? So you could make out that this is how the attitude has changed. So just to answer your question, you're looking to be a bit contrarian, which is that you're looking to go when people are not that interested in going, and you're looking to head for the hills when everyone is crowding in and says that this is the place to be.
So that means your travel is often, against the tide. The place is a great place to go for a holiday, then you probably won't invest there. And if a place is terrible for a holiday, you'll probably invest there. Do you have some kind of principle like that?
Well, I think that, the big sort of risk we face, the occupational hazard, is that we let our heart rule the head. So you go to South Africa, you instantly fall in love with it in terms of the, the wildlife, Cape Town, etc. But you got to control yourself, because at least today I feel that South Africa is one of the riskiest countries to invest in.
Okay.
So it's one country that I like to go and spend an extra weekend in. But I have to be very careful, because even though it's a beautiful place to visit, I think it's one of the riskiest places to invest in today, because social tensions are really rising in South Africa. As the unemployment rate is 25%, among the blacks it's close to 50% or something. And it's a real sort of tinderbox, and they don't know how to solve this problem.
So your tourist dollars shouldn't follow your investment dollars.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's the way to put it. Yeah.
Great. Now, one of the points you make in your book is that in the period of 2003 onwards, there was this huge boom where China was growing, there was a commodity boom, interest rates were low, and so there was a rising tide where countries were growing rapidly, and they often thought that they were doing a great job and that's why they were growing rapidly, but in reality they were growing because of these macro conditions. Do you feel this is what made a lot of people become complacent?
Yeah, I think one question which in India also we did not answer, and this is true of most emerging markets, that what happened in 2003? Because until 2002, India's growth rate was ambling along at a decent pace of about 5.5%, 6% or so. Then something magical happened in 2003 when India's growth rate exploded to about 8.5%, 9%, and it remained that way till the end of the decade.
Okay.
And the whole question people don't answer is that what happened in 2003? And to me, the combination of the fact that you had a lot of easy money in the world, and you had emerging markets which were sort of rising as in unison. Every single emerging market was doing well. I think that's the point we missed out. Between 2003 and 2007, every single emerging market in the world, from Brazil to Russia to Turkey to Indonesia, every single emerging market was doing well. Yeah, the whole world was doing well. Yeah. And the peak year was 2007. There are about 180 economies in the world today which are tracked by the IMF. Of the 180 economies in 2007, only 3 economies reported a negative growth rate. Only 3. Mm-hmm. In any typical year, about 20 to 30% of the economies report a negative GDP growth rate. In 2007, the boom was so synchronous that only 3 countries reported a growth rate which was negative. And which were those 3 countries? Those were Fiji, Zimbabwe, and some other country in Africa, Congo. And so my point was, who cares, right? I mean,
what was the global confluence of events which led to this rising tide? 3-4 things came together. So what happened?
Well, I think what happened then was that we got zero interest rates began in the US. The US really began the zero interest rate policy back then, so which led to a lot of global liquidity. And also because emerging markets had gone through their series of crises in 97, 98, Russia, Asia, etc. So they had cleaned up their balance sheets. So they were positioned to sort of grow well after that. So this combination of having clean balance sheets and also the fact that you had sort of very easy liquidity with zero interest rates coming from the US, that rising tide of global liquidity and very strong US consumer led to this synchronous boom across all emerging markets.
Okay. And so you're saying that a lot of people thought they had done something different, but actually the whole world was rising and took advantage of that.
Yeah, because India's growth rate went from 5.5 to 8.5, 9%, and the growth rate of all emerging markets on average went from 3.5 to 7%.
Oh, okay.
3.5 to 7%. So it was too much of a coincidence to say that this is all about India. This was really a rising tide that was lifting all boats.
So what's your reading of what happened in India in the last 10 years? I mean, as a big emerging market, and in fact, your company Morgan Stanley was one of the first global investors to discover India way back in 92 after the first liberalization, and I remember your predecessors like Madhav Dhar, Vinod Sethi all had done a lot of investment here. So as you saw India in this context of emerging markets, what did you see in the last 10 years, that is?
I think not just India, I think many countries began to lose the plot, which is that many countries began to spend away their windfall and they stopped reforming. Because I think that most countries grow well because they tend to systematically reform. In India's case, what happened was that they stopped reforming. That between 2003 and 2010, you can hardly mention any meaningful progressive reforms. And all the policy decisions that were taken
I'll take that message back.
And all the decisions which were taken then were about just redistributing wealth, not creating new wealth, just redistributing wealth. I think that's what happened between 2003 to 2010. We mistook the boom for being local rather than global, and we spent that money that we got in a lot of giveaways rather than in creating wealth. And I think there were other sort of fault lines which were also developing. One big problem was this commodities boom. As we got this big boom in commodity prices that took place, I think a lot of crony capitalism arose because of that. Because a lot of people made money by just digging dirt from the ground, not from genuine entrepreneurial talent of the kind that the created, other companies created in the 1990s.
So I think one of the points you make in your book was that something similar happened in Brazil, that, about 20, 25 years back, Brazil was the hot country in some sense, and then people are predicting huge, unlimited, uninterrupted growth, and then something happened, and it petered off for 20 years. So what is the lesson from the Brazilian experience?
I think the big lesson here is that 180 odd economies, as I mentioned, in the world today, only 35 are developed. Okay. Everyone else is an emerging market. And Brazil is that archetypal emerging market which tends to do well for 1 decade, then they'll make some policy mistakes, and then for the next decade or two they will regress, or not being able to catch up to the West. So for the last 100 years, that's been the history of Brazil, and that's been one of the big problems as far as Brazil is concerned, that they have 1 good decade, then they relax, I go to the beach, and everything is fine, and then you end up having a lot of problems after that in terms of what goes on. And there's too much welfare spending in Brazil. So that's one of the mistakes I think that we could end up making, because we mistake this boom to be something which is self-sustaining, rather than the fact that we need to do work on our own.
So going back to your point, one of the things you talk about is the commodity boom, which was that linked to the growth of China, because China was consuming huge amounts of materials for building China?
Yeah, I think it was linked to the demand shock from China, and also the fact that supply was in short supply. Because if you look at supply of commodity in the 1980s and 1990s, commodity prices were continuously declining. And in that period, very little new investment came up for commodities. So you got the rise of China which took place, and very little supply to meet the rising demand from China. So that combination was a deadly combination. But this has been the 200-year history of commodity prices, which is 1 decade up, then 2 decades down. That's been the long history of commodity prices, because commodities is not something which really requires genuine entrepreneurial talent or genuine sort of intellectual talent. It is something which you get lucky with.
Just like a pickaxe and dig and...
That's right. So you get lucky with it. And it's very interesting as to how this boom took place. A decade ago, about 1/3 of all the billionaires in the world were from sectors such as technology, telecom, the TMT sector.
Pharma, all that.
Exactly. But by 2010, 1/3 of the billionaires in the world were from sectors such as energy, materials, basically making a lot of money from digging dirt from the ground, not from genuine entrepreneurial talent.
So is the billionaire list one of your metrics? Like you go to a country and say, give me the billionaire list, and all the billionaires are making money on iron ore or coal, then you say, hey, this country has an issue.
Absolutely true.
So is that one of your rules?
Yeah, one of the rules of the road, and something which I mentioned in the book as well, is something called a Billionaires Index, which is that this is what we try and comprise, which is that we look at the number of billionaires in each country. And if we think that the billionaires control too much of the wealth of that country, we think that's a negative sign. If too much of the wealth being created is coming from sectors such as commodities rather than genuine entrepreneurial sectors, we think that's a negative sign. And the third factor to look at that billionaires list is that you need churn. You need some new names to keep coming up. When you don't get enough new names coming up, that's a problem. So in India's case, in fact, on all these 3 factors, they were flashing red by 2010. Because if you look at India, the billionaires, their wealth as a share of GDP was well over 10%. And to me 10% is the cutoff line. And very few countries in the world do billionaires have more than 10% of the country's wealth. And those are Russia, Mexico, Malaysia. All countries where that things are not that hunky-dory.
Do they give you a visa all this time? The way you talk about
Well, I've been told not to go back to Russia for a while, so I'm staying away from
there. There's room for you in Siberia or something.
That's right. Or go to some country where you find a drug has been slipped into your sort of that or something. But I find that that India was flashing red on that signal. The second signal was that if you look at India's billionaire wealth, very few new billionaires came up in India in the last 5 years.
A lot of non-commodity stuff, or
in general.
In general.
A lot of the billionaires in the top 10 were the old billionaires. Now there'll always be old billionaires, but you need new companies to come up. You need a new sort of Apple, Google to come up from nowhere. And that tells you that the laws of creative destruction are working very well in this country. So India is flashing red. And 3, a lot of the billionaires coming up were coming up from sectors such as commodities, and those sectors are not sort of that productive. So India was flashing red on all those 3 things. The good news now I find is that we're getting some correction of this. Like one real good factor is that in the top 10 billionaires list, after a long time we have a new billionaire who is not from a commodity sector.
Oh really? Who is this lucky guy?
And this is Dilip Sanghvi from Sun Pharma. So we have a new billionaire come up. So you need more of these instances to come up where the wealth is not being created because of government connections or real estate or commodities.
But tell me, one more sort of byproduct of what you just described is with the rise of this crony capitalism and this sense that people are making their money by getting coal cheap or iron ore cheap or whatever, has it also in some sense in India diminished the support for market economy, that people are saying maybe it's better to go back to the good old days because this is not what we got, this is not what we wanted?
Yeah, this is what happened in Latin America too. But you need reforms to be, to feel supportive. You need other people to sort of feel included in the process. And when they feel that wealth is being created by unfair means, that leads to a backlash against reforms.
Okay.
And so therefore I think that this is one of the things I have in fact against the current government too, which is the fact that when the first signs of this were emerging in 2010, I remember doing this Newsweek cover story back then, and the response was that this is the price we have to pay. This is the price we have to pay for our growth, that if that some sort of bad side effects will take place. But no, you have to correct those side effects. You have to do it preemptively rather than wait for a backlash and then you have negative fallouts from that.
Sure. Now let's just go back to this whole commodity boom. You said there was a cycle of 10 years of boom and 20 years of bust.
Right.
So this commodity boom began about 10 years back. So are we now entering the reverse of the cycle? Are we now going to see a downturn in commodities?
Yeah, I think the signs of that are already emerging. Many commodity prices over the last year or so have been doing quite poorly. And I think that even in some key commodities such as oil, we are finding that a lot of new discoveries are taking place. I think this is America's big comeback story, which is their energy revolution that's taking place out there. So I think that this is what happens. A lot of new investments are coming up, a lot of new sort of technology is coming up to try to sort of get new sources of energy. So to me, the fact that commodity prices, that the commodity super cycle is coming to an end is in fact a very good thing. I think that this is going to once again get investment flowing in the right areas rather than suck up too much in the wrong areas.
So you feel that it'll help India, right? Because India is a big commodity consumer and therefore it will help us and will hopefully reduce this cronyism too.
Yes, I think so. I think that one of the big sort of positives for India in the coming decade could be lower commodity prices.
Okay. Now let's just go, we talked about the US, and one of the big stories of the last 5 years in the US has been that extraordinary growth in new energy sources thanks to innovations in gas drilling and fracking and all kinds of things. And US also has been the source of great innovation in technology. So do you now see the US as the new big emerging market?
Well, I think that, in the new chapter for the book that I'm coming out with, the epilogue, I've extended this argument of breakout nations to the developed world. And one thing I mentioned there is that in the developed world, if I were to pick a breakout nation, it would be America.
Okay.
So I think that the US is staging some sort of a renaissance. I think it's happening in manufacturing. I think it's happening in energy. And here's the most important statistic. 1/3 of the total spend on research and development in the world is done in America. 1/3.
Wow.
So they really still remain at the cutting edge of that. So all the new cutting edge technology, which comes from Apple, Google, all that still comes out of the West Coast in America. So the other countries are able to imitate, copy, but the origin of a lot of this new source of innovation still comes out from the US because of the amount they spend on research and development.
So, but does that mean, for example, you manage 25 billion in emerging markets? You can't spend that money in America, right? Somebody else is doing that. So what happens to all the money? I mean, do you have other winners? I mean, in your entire travels, are there any other hot spots that you like and which you think will be big in the coming decade?
Well, that's the good thing about emerging markets, right?
There are many of them.
Exactly. It covers 80% of the world's population.
Yeah.
So there's always some rising star and there are always some failures out there. So I think that in the book I've come out with a series of countries which could be the breakout nations over the next 5 years or so. I speak about countries in Southeast Asia, such as Philippines, as I mentioned to you earlier. I speak about Indonesia, Thailand. I speak about countries such as Turkey, Eastern Europe, and Africa, such as Nigeria. So to me, these are the new stars which are emerging. And many of them are emerging because they did quite poorly over the past decade or two. So that's the natural cycle. That you do poorly over the last decade or two, your back's to the wall, you have an incentive to reform. You do very well for a decade or two, you fritter the gains away. And here's the interesting thing about India. I was thinking about this about India too. The last 30 to 40 years, India has also followed a very nice 10-year cycle, which is that every 10 years, we have some sort of a macroeconomic crisis. And that usually sets the stage for the next advance to begin. I think that last year was some sort of a mini macroeconomic crisis in India, where the rupee seemed to be sort of falling out of bed. The rating agencies were under downgrade, and we've seen a lot of reform steps take place in India from September onwards. In 1991, something similar happened. 1980, something similar happened. Both those times we went to the IMF to sort of seek assistance, and we carried out reforms on the back of that assistance that we sought. And in 2001 also we carried out a lot of reforms after the bust in the technology sector, and India's growth rate really fell down to about 3-4% for a year or two in 2001, 2002. Okay. So I think that's the whole point, that every time you end up, every 10 years, you end up getting some sort of a reform cycle which takes place. So India, to me, in the book I'm a bit equivocal about India. I think it's 50-50, the chances of being a breakout nation. But I think that the signs are improving, at least at the margin, because of these factors over the past year.
So you talked about the rupee. So how big is this currency stuff in all this? I mean, you know, overvalued currencies, undervalued currencies, you know, how do you make sense of all that?
Well, it's a bit counterintuitive, but here's my rule of the road, which I think is easy to do.
Please write this down.
That one of the privileges I have is that whenever we travel to one of these emerging markets, we get to stay in really good hotels.
That's sort of the frills of your job.
That's right. So one of the indices I've created in the book is something called the Four Seasons Index, which is that if you go to any emerging market, the benchmark hotel to stay in is the Four Seasons or the equivalent. And you see what the room rate is at the Four Seasons hotel. And if the room rate is really cheap, you know this place is competitive. If it's really expensive, you know this place is really expensive and it's not that competitive. So example, you go today to Brazil or Russia and you want to stay in one of the fancy rooms in Rio facing, you know, the Ipanema beach, or you want to stay in Moscow near the Red Square, you're paying up to $1,000 a night for a room rate in those countries. And you know that that is problem for those countries. You go to a place like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, the same hotel equivalent of the Four Seasons, you're paying about $200 to $300 a night. So I think to me that really tells you about the fact that you need cheap currency.
Okay.
So in India, one of the mistakes we made was that a currency got really expensive and uncompetitive. But the fact that the rupee has fallen, I know, is not a great sign for many people. It's a loss of confidence. But I think that the rupee has corrected. It's made India more competitive. And we need a weaker exchange rate. Not one which is out of crisis, but generally an undervalued exchange rate to do well at this per capita income level.
Okay. Now tell me, you know, we talked about some of the changes, right? One is that the commodity cycle is coming to an end. Easy money will continue because the West will continue to pump easy money. You talked about the fact that US has now has cheap energy, and also US has done a lot of things on robotics and 3D manufacturing. So manufacturing actually may move back to the US from China and elsewhere. Similarly, there are service automation going on with all these clouds and so on. So there could be services also moving back. So what does this mean for emerging markets which grew on commodity prices, outsourcing and offshoring? So is there a fundamental change happening, you think, in these areas?
Yeah, I think two things. That one, that the competition is just getting tougher, because apart from US, the other place, you know, where value is really emerging is Europe. And again, this sounds very counterintuitive that Europe's in a real big mess today, but it's really cheap. Okay. That, for example, you go to Spain, Italy, etc. These countries, their sort of labor costs have fallen, and you're seeing a lot of competitiveness come back. So the competition now is much more intense in these countries. That you need, like in these countries, it's going to be a lot more difficult now to try and compete with them. So that's a big change. But the second thing is that these emerging markets are so big in size, about 70 to 80% of the global population, that some new stars will keep emerging. So the good news is that these commodity exporting countries may not do that well, but commodity importing countries may do quite well. So there's a change in leadership that's taking place in emerging markets, one from the other. But as I say in the book also, the closing line, that when there is no wind, row, which is that the tailwinds you had over the past decade of easy money and the fact that the West was willing to invest a lot in emerging markets and those economies were sort of in relative decline, that trend is showing at the signs of turning around, and now the competition becomes more intense.
But to row, you have to be in good shape, right?
You have to be in good shape, yeah.
Yeah. Now let me just, let's get back to India. Now, you know, you just said that India 50-50 and all that. Incidentally, Ram Gua also says the same. He says India is 50-50 based on Johnny Walker and all that. So you're both on the same thesis. Where do you see India? I know you would like to be overly prescriptive and all that, but you've been an India watcher for 20 years. Now you've seen the whole world. You come back here. A lot of the things you have said have been very prescient. So where do you see the future?
Well, I think that as far as India is concerned, this is one country I remain genuinely conflicted upon. And maybe because I'm too close to the situation, that other countries you tend to get a more dispassionate view because you go to these other countries and you go to a Brazil, you go to a Russia, you can see it more dispassionately. And I'm quite negative on those countries, as some which are positive. India, maybe I see the picture too closely, and so therefore I'm very conflicted about it. But I think at the margin things have improved because expectations have come off. So I think in India's case, the last decade was all about the fact that 8-9% spreadsheets out, extrapolate this endlessly into the future. Expectations have come off. Today that 8-9% kind of talk is now out of the window. Now we're talking about 6%. We're talking about that being the new normal. So I think that expectations coming off is a very good thing as far as India is concerned. And then the fact that we are reforming with our back to the wall. And the fact that I think the other thing, in India I find in my travels, is that the chief ministers of this country which are emerging, the new chief ministers in India states, to me are much more competent than what they used to be compared to a decade or two ago. And the fact that in India we see, so what's happening in India I think is that the model is changing. The old model of India's growth was a very centralized model, which is top down from Delhi and you dictate stuff. Now in India what we're seeing basically, this is emerging more as an idea like Europe, which is a collection of states. And each state is much more autonomous and very different. And we're finding more successful chief ministers get elected on the back of a development platform, which was not happening. Like one statistic today, there are 6 chief ministers in this country today that have won an election 3 times.
Really?
Or more. And about 2 decades ago, apart from one chief minister in a state called West Bengal, no other chief minister was able to win more than 2 elections.
In a state called West Bengal.
Well, because I mean to say that because I think that's one state that's not been able to sort of do that well economically.
Okay.
So I think that's been the issue, as far as that state's concerned. But I think that many other states in India today are re-electing their leaders on a positive development platform, and that was not happening in this country 2 to 3 decades ago. So that is the big change which has taken place in India, and to me that is the single biggest source I have of optimism on India. But this centralized Delhi national control model, I think that model is in decline.
But if you had to name 3 or 4 reforms that need to get done, what would you say?
Well, I think one, that this culture of welfareism, I think this is something which is really, I'm not against it, but you can only write checks which your exchequer can cash. Right, so we need to sort of have a control on our spending habits because we really lost discipline on the spending habits over the last decade or so. I think that's one thing which is very important. I think the second thing is to to create a more level playing field, so you have new entrepreneurs who arise rather than the old holdovers which do very well. So you want more churn on the billionaires list. You want new sort of people to come up there. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And I think that we just need much greater discipline in this country. Look at inflation. Look at how we've lost the plot here. We do a ranking of inflation, that India for decades used to be in the middle of the inflation rankings. There were 180 economies in the world. India was somewhere in the middle. Last 3 years, of the 180 economies in the world, India's inflation ranking is 150 to 160.
Really?
Yeah. So now that's a shocking statistic. So that's the kind of stuff you need to get back in control for this country to be on track again.
So, but overall, are you optimistic, pessimistic, realistic?
50-50. Right? That's, yes.
You should have even Steve.
Yeah, I think that is India at the margin. I've turned positive since the book came out. When I came out with the book last year, the initial reaction, here's the other thing which I've learned about writing a global book, that no matter how global you want to be, the first thing that the person wants to know is what is he or she saying about my country. That is the first thing that they want to know. And I learned this lesson the hard way, again going back into some of this travel experience. I spoke at the last Lit Fest I spoke at was at Edinburgh in Scotland. I was speaking at the Lit Fest. I gave my global spiel like I'm doing with you here. The first question from the audience was, do you think Scotland can be a breakout nation? Right? So now, I never thought about that, but it taught me that when you go to any place, be as local as possible.
Okay.
So I think that as far as India is concerned, I've learned the same thing, that I wrote the book. I wrote about the world, but the first thing people want to know, India. What is the view on India? But it's interesting how sentiment shifted, that when the book first came out, the popular reaction in the press was that you're being too pessimistic by saying it's 50-50. By August last year, the reaction was you're being too optimistic by giving India a 50% chance. So the needle completely
But going back to your theory that you invest when things look the worst or whatever, by that theory then it's a good time.
Yeah, I think it's a better time. I think it's a better time, but I still feel it's a long slog ahead. But it's definitely like a better time to be investing today than it was a year ago, or especially not when that exporter's son was telling me that where else will the money go but here in India.
Maybe you should call him up now and check his mood, you know.
Yeah, that's right. That would be a good telltale sign.
Yeah. So I think this is a good segue to get to the audience. So I think Shirish, are you going to anchor this? Or you?
Sorry.
Okay. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You've been speaking against welfareism. So what I really want to know is...
Where are you?
I'm right here. You want me to get up?
Yeah.
Okay. So Richard, if you don't believe in growth with equity,
Yeah.
how do you meet the revolution of rising expectations? That's question one. Question two, when you're throwing out 8 to 9% growth out of the window, and the rest of the world is not growing and we're growing at 6%, don't you think we stand a chance of being 80-20? And when you rejoice in the growth of the regional satraps, don't you think they will derail focused decision making at the center?
Okay, that's a lot for me to cover. Let me try and do it one by one. I think that is fine. I'm not against welfareism, but my point is if you look at the economic miracle stories of the world, such as China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, all these countries were able to sort of really grow at a very rapid pace. It's about doing right welfare at the right time. That, for example, today, Korea, the amount they spend on welfare as a share of the GDP is less than India, and yet they're an economic success story. So it's about the balance. In fact, I would argue today that Korea needs to spend more on welfare than they're doing today. So it's a question of getting the balance right. Otherwise, there's no end to it in terms of how much you spend and what you end up doing with it. So it's about getting the balance right. I just think that we went over the top a bit in the last 5 years. So I think that's the point about welfare. Second point is that expectations are very key. That now you can't compare India's growth rate with the rest of the world because our wealth is so low. Our per capita income is only $1,500. At that low per capita income level, you need very fast growth to lift people out of poverty. And if you grow at 5% or so, that's a major disappointment because this thing about rising expectations, that in a country as such where we got used to 8 to 9% growth, a 5-6% growth feels like a recession. And the benchmark changes because in America, if you go today, even though the economy has not been growing, but the fact that they have a per capita income level of $40,000, they don't suffer as much. But when we have low growth rates, we really tend to suffer a lot. So I think that it's those two factors. Now the third thing about regional satraps, any model has its flaws. But I think it's still a better model, which is that rather than a very heavily centralized controlled model of having more regional empowerment is, I think, a more powerful way for growth because that's the natural fabric of this country. When this country was a great economic power back in the 17th century, when it controlled about 20% of the world's economic output, it was a very loose federation. It was not a heavy centralized state. This heavy centralized state is a very recent phenomenon in India, which came about post-independence, especially under Indira Gandhi when she wanted to control the nation because she feared that the country was breaking apart and there were risks to sovereignty. But India's natural social fabric, given its diversity, is that it's more a collection of states like Europe rather than a homogeneous entity. And in this way, we're very different compared to China.
Well, thank you. But don't you think that if you do not have a safety net for poor people, and if disparities continue to grow, that is a threat to growth in itself?
Absolutely, it is, ma'am. But I mean, the whole issue is that what will correct the disparity? So in China's case, in Korea's case, in Taiwan's case, it was about opening up more opportunities for the underprivileged rather than giving dole-outs.
Okay, I think
it's a question of that.
There's a question. A request again, please. If everyone can keep their questions fairly short and make sure they are actually questions, that'll be great. So no statements, just questions.
Yeah. Very quick question. Thanks, Nandan. I'm Hindu Gupta. I'm senior editor for Fortune in India. It's very fascinating, your book. I wanted to ask you, what about breakdown nations? One of the fear that we have in India is about countries that will break down and how it impacts us. And it's not just us. The Germans constantly fear that the Americans, if they discover energy and become isolationist again, what will happen to the regional balances around the world? What will happen to the Pacific Fleet, for instance? So how do you take into account breakdown nations and how it will impact us?
Yeah, I think there are lots of breakdown nations mentioned in the book. Some of those candidates I mentioned are Brazil, Russia kind of countries, that I speak about that. I think that the good thing here is that there are always sort of leadership changes which are going on. There are some countries which do well for a while, then fall off the map. There are some other countries which rise. So I think that's a constant process of churn which is taking place. But we find more and more countries within the global fold trying to liberalize, trying to sort of grow rather than to break down. But yeah, we're I totally agree with you that there are very often countries, if I show you the list of countries which were the economic stars in the world in the 1950s and 1960s, you'll be surprised. They included Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan. Those countries were growing at more than 5% in the 1960s, and look what happened to them. So I think there's constant churn which is going on, and I think that's what's really happening currently as well, that some of the stars are falling off the map and new stars are arising.
Could we find a question in the back? Yeah, please.
Mr. Sharma, I just want to ask you, do you see any potential of any breakout nations emerging from the European Union, despite the huge debt crisis going through? Or will most of those countries go down the same rocky path that Greece did?
For what it's worth, I wrote this piece like a couple of months ago that 2013 will be the year of Europe. So I'm relatively, I feel a bit optimistic on Europe because things are so badly beaten down there that they may have no way to go but up. And some of the breakout nations I mentioned in Europe, could be some of these economies like Ireland, Spain. I think that these are places where things are so badly beaten down that they may have no place to go but up. In many ways, I covered the East Asian economic crisis in 97-98 as an investor. And similar things were said about Indonesia, Thailand. There were riots on the street of Indonesia. The world thought that they'd lost this country to globalization, and look at how successfully it came back. So often, this is Nandan's point, that you look to buy or you look to invest at times when things are really beaten down, and I find many parts of Europe today very beaten down, and so therefore I think there's a sliver of hope. Now, it will not be easy, it will not be a straight line, but I think that if you have a 5-10-year horizon, those could be the places where some breakout nations could emerge from.
I think we had another question right here, gentleman in the black sweater.
Hi Ruchir, thanks a lot for this conversation. So, one thing which I needed to ask is we are so much obsessed with GDP, right? The GDP growth numbers 8.5, 9%, so on and so forth. But how much does it relate to the breakout nation? How much does it correlate to the breakout nation? The reason I'm asking is recently I read in The Economist for 2013, the top 5 nations in terms of GDP growth are the Gambia, Macau, Mongolia, right, and Bhutan. Right. But they don't figure out. Sure. Yeah. But they don't figure out in your analysis. So I'm kind of curious to know that how much of GDP relates to your breakout nation thing.
No, GDP is a very important sort of thing, but two factors. Those countries don't matter because I hate to say it, they're too small to matter. So therefore, I've not sort of gone into them. I've tried to restrict the analysis to the top 20 sort of large emerging markets rather than the smaller ones. And the second point that I'll mention here is that I talk about expectations. That expectations are key. That expectations need to be surpassed. As I said, that when India is expecting 8 to 9 and you deliver 5 to 6, even though 5 to 6 may appear very good in absolute terms, that's a real disappointment. On the other hand, when you expect the US economy to be in recession and they grow by 2 to 3%, that's a positive surprise. So for me, this expectation is a very important element in coming up with breakout or breakdown nations.
Thanks a lot. Sure. If I'm allowed to, I'd just like to...
I think we should try and give other people a chance, if you don't mind. Just 1 second, sir. One second. There was someone already waiting in the back there.
Rule of the road and 50-50, very short term. In India, if you drive on the left side of the road, it is the right side. If you drive on the right side of the road, it is the wrong side. Left is right and right is wrong. Regarding 50-50, one industry as chief guy came to another place where only 50. He told you at your place only 50% are working, 50% are not working. While at my place, we think it's reverse.
Right. Thank you, sir. I think that was an observation. Gentleman in the back row there.
Ruchir?
Yes, sir.
I really enjoyed your book. And I'd like to ask you were very optimistic about your analysis of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Does that analysis and optimism still hold? after 2 years?
Yes, I think that as far as Poland is concerned, I still remain okay. I think Poland has suffered a bit because of the crises in Europe, but I think that Poland is one of those places where I think they have always reformed even when their back's not to the wall, so therefore they have been one of the most successful countries to emerge from Eastern Europe after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So I still remain optimistic on those countries, and partly, as I mentioned earlier, that because I think that Europe is stabilizing, I think Poland could do well over the next few years or so. So I still think that that analysis so far holds. Thank you.
Just 1 second, there's a queue system here, so I'll come to you next. There's a gentleman here on the,
Ruchir, first of all, compliments for your book. I think I left economics far behind, but now started reading it again after I read your book. And I realized a lot of practicality and a lot of stuff which we never used to like in our school days.
Thank you very much.
My question is that we talk about Billionaire Index, we talk about 4 Seasons Index, we talk about easy money, but no one's talking about inequality of wealth and any index created on inequality of wealth. We have people who are like sleeping with 1 square meal a day or not even 1 meal a day, lying on the roads. And no one in this world, in any book, I get to read about an inequality of wealth index wherein we say that, okay, how is an economy going to develop when everyone's going to get 1 square meal a day? Yeah, thank you.
No, I think that that's a very relevant point. But I mean, some of these indices like Billionaires Index, etc., try and address that point, which is that it's a very top-down way of looking at it. But when you have too much inequality, it shows up in those indices as well. If you got too much concentration of wealth taking place among just a few billionaires, that's a negative sign. So I agree with you. But if you look at the big economic miracle stories, right? We have a roadmap in front of us. We have China, we have Korea, we have Taiwan, we have Japan. All those countries were able to grow very rapidly and lift those people out of poverty. That's been the only antidote to growth. Now the growth, of course, has to be sort of inclusive. It can't be a growth where only a few people are benefiting, because that growth will not last. You get a backlash against reforms when you end up having a growth which is seen as being very exclusive. So it needs to be inclusive. But in the end, there is nothing like a rising tide of growth which lifts people out of poverty. That's how China, Korea, Taiwan, etc. have been able to develop from a similar stage as us. Remember, Korea and India used to have the same per capita income level 40 years ago. Today, Korea's per capita income level is $20,000. We are still at $1,500.
Young woman in the front row, and then there's a lady in the back. So you first, please.
Ruchir has always said that before thinking about yourself, at times you think about the neighbor. So I'd like to ask a question about China, that where does China stand in this boom and bust cycle and in the reform cycle, and how does it impact India in the future, like till 2020?
Yeah. I'm so happy that you qualify as 2020, because that's a practical time frame. Because when people talk 2050, I sleep over, as you know. So talking about China, I think as far as China is concerned, I'm getting more and more concerned about China. I've been a huge fan of China, their growth rate, but I think that now they've grown too big to grow so fast. And what's happening there is that I think that a lot of the very important reform steps that they need to take are getting more and more difficult. So as far as China is concerned, I think it's become too large to grow so quickly. But I think there's one positive element of that, which, and we spend a lot of time on that, because I know it's one of Nandan's favorite topics as well, that a fallout of China slowing down could be lower commodity prices. So as China's growth slows down, I think it could take the edge of commodity prices. But the margin, I'm getting more and more concerned about China, because I think it's grown for 30 years now at 10%. Its per capita income level today is $6,500, $7,000. This is exactly the stage at which many other economic miracles began to slow down. Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Not a crash, but began to significantly slow down. And I suspect that process is underway in China also now.
Thank you. There are going to be 2 questions more, and the mics are already with the questioners. Woman in the back there, please.
Now, in this story of breaking out and breaking down of nations, I would like to know what is the role that corruption in a particular nation plays, and also the Swiss bank accounts of people, do they come into the investment at all?
Well, I think that, corruption is obviously a very important sort of role, because when perception, here's the truth, here's the blunt truth, that the poorer a country is, the typically more corrupt it tends to be. That's just a relationship. If you look at the Transparency International's indices, that's just what it tends to be. The question is the direction. that is the corruption reducing as you're growing more quickly, or is the corruption getting worse? And here's the bad news about India, that India's rankings in the corruption indices taken out by Transparency International over the past decade have in fact deteriorated. And that's negative, because typically when a country grows, corruption tends to reduce. Because as you get wealthier, societies tend to get less corrupt. Now, it's a chicken egg thing which comes first, but that's the rule. So I think in India's case, it is concerning that the last year, our rankings on the Transparency International's corruption indices have fallen, even though the economy has doubled in size. So I think corruption is a concern, and when you see that kind of movement, it's a negative flag. But as I said, there are many factors we look at, but among the rules of the road, I would say when corruption is rising, even though wealth is increasing, that's a negative sign, because that's not sustainable.
Thank you very much for this discussion. President Obama, in his inauguration speech, I think mentioned climate change 3 times. You've spoken about the energy revolution. Mayor Bloomberg talked about climate change after Hurricane Sandy. How do you factor in rising global temperatures in terms of breakout nations, breakdown nations? Who's going to benefit? How is that all factored in? Because it's not just a myth, it's real.
Well, I think this is one of those factors where we'll all sink and swim together. I mean, the whole idea of breakout nations is to distinguish between different countries, right? Which will do well, which will not. This issue of global warming is a global phenomenon. So, I mean, this is not something which I think I'm in a position to address, because my attempt in the book is to try and differentiate. And I think that what you're talking about is a global phenomenon where everyone's affected equally by it. So, yeah, I mean, like, this is one of those things which I don't have a sort of expertise to analyze in, because I think this is a very global phenomenon. So, I mean, you're right to be concerned about it, but I'm not quite sure if I'm in a position to address this particular thing in terms of breakout nations.
I think there is one last question, but that privilege goes to Nandan for having so wonderfully steered this conversation.
Thank you. You know, there's one question which I think everybody likes to ask, and you talked about Korea, you talked about China. How much does democracy versus an authoritarian regime in the growth years, how much does that matter? What's your own experience in all these nations?
Well, I think that's a great question, because we looked at it. You know, after the rise of China, there's been a lot of talk in the world that to grow very rapidly, you need an authoritarian regime, that, you know, so that someone sort of cracks the whip, gets the reforms done, and you grow. But that's the myth, because for every country like China which succeeds, you end up getting other countries under authoritarian regimes which do very poorly. So I think so we had to look at 120 cases in the world, high growth cases over the last 3 decades, which are countries that were able to grow at 5% or more for a decade. And how many of them were authoritarian? How many of them were democratic? Here's the answer, 50-50, right? Half the countries in the world were authoritarian, half the countries were democratic.
You're a good economist.
So in terms of the fact that that the regime, whether it's authoritarian or democratic, is not the important factor in distinguishing whether you are going to be successful or not. It's the quality of leadership at the top. So for every China that succeeds, I can produce for you 5 authoritarian countries which do not succeed.
Okay.
And there are increasing number of democracies, newly formed democracies, whether it's a Poland or it's countries in like the CIS, the former Soviet republics, which have done very well under a new democratic regime. So really, this answer is not democracy versus authoritarianism. That's 50-50. It's the quality of leadership at the top in terms of their economic focus.
Great, Ruchir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharma. Thank you so much.
I recommend Breakout Nations is as good as this interview.
Thank you so much. Thank you 100.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, Ruchir and Nandan, please accept from gifts from us. Do note that Ruchir will be signing his books in the signing area there. If you don't already have copies of the books, they're available at the Full Circle bookstore. But Ruchir will now be moving there, and if you want to interact with him, that's where you'll find him. Thank you.